Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Google Campus Tel Aviv for hosting us here. Bitcoin is an amazing technology based on mathematical principles, but technology is developed and used by people, and where there's people, there's also politics. And to talk with us about the relation between Bitcoin and politics, we have here Peter Todd, special guest who came here all the way from Canada, who is a Bitcoin core developer and Mastercoin chief scientist. So please welcome Peter Todd. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so, and I guess what's kind of interesting about Bitcoin is what I'm talking about isn't politics in the sense of politics just surrounding Bitcoin naturally. You know, Linux kernel, it has politics. All sorts of open source projects have politics. What's interesting with Bitcoin is that the protocol itself inherently has politics. And I think the reason is really a question of, is Bitcoin backed by math? And it's sort of a common statement. You hear a lot of people saying, you know, you can trust Bitcoin, your Bitcoins are valuable because they're backed by math. And unfortunately, it's not actually that simple. I mean, if it were, it'd be great. We all know cryptography is very strong. I love this quote by Bruce Schneier, brute force attacks since 256-bit keys will be infeasible until computers are built from something other than matter and occupy something other than space. And that's part of a longer article he has on just working out the math of trying to attack a brute force key. Unfortunately, while normal crypto, it's very easy to get exponential difficulty for your attacker. You have a linear cost to you. Your key is, say 256 bits large, and your attacker has to do 2 to the power 256 bits work. That's essentially impossible. Bitcoin, however, it's trying to solve something other than simply signing a statement. It's trying to solve something known as the double spend problem. Here you have me giving transaction 1 to Alice, and Alice knows that I really did make that true statement because I signed it, and she can trust the cryptographic signature. Unfortunately, she is not really sure whether or not I also gave the same Bitcoin to Bob. And fundamentally, the problem here is that both of these statements are true. Both have valid signatures. So Bitcoin solves this problem. Unfortunately, it doesn't solve this problem as well as we might like. It solves it with this concept I like to call proof of publication. And the big difference is in cryptography, you're trying to go prove that a statement has been made. I said Bob can go have a Bitcoin or Alice can have a Bitcoin. And we looked at our digital signature, and we can assume that I have the right to do so. What double spending is really saying is, I want to go prove that I did not make a statement, which is that the other party did not get that Bitcoin. And proof of publication, well, one way to think about it is, if I'm giving Alice that Bitcoin, I'm proving to her that I published that message on some medium that we all agree to use as the definition of what is a valid Bitcoin transaction. And similarly, she can also go and get a similar proof that I did not make another statement that Bob has that Bitcoin, or Charles has that Bitcoin, or something else. And unfortunately, with proof of publication, since we've declared some medium by which this publication happens, well, we're really coming to consensus about what messages have been published. And consensus, I could get into mining in a lot more detail, but long story short, it ends up being sort of a human scale notion. Bitcoin has this ability to let people add themselves to the consensus, remove themselves from consensus based on the proof of work, also known as mining. But fundamentally, that's just people. I mean, if I'm the attacker, all I have to do is outvote everyone else. And this has led to a lot of politics. A good example is, you may have heard of mining pools, where if I'm going to earn money doing this Bitcoin mining thing, turning energy and turning into work to vote in this consensus, well, because Bitcoin has blocks and there's only one every 10 minutes, if I want to go and get income in any reasonable amount of time, I can join a pool of other like-minded people. and those like-minded people agree to take all the earnings they earn and distribute it across multiple people. I just took this snapshot of the Bitcoin mining pool percentages earlier today. There's like ghash.io, there's I think Discus, BTC Guild, Eligius. There's a lot fewer parties involved than thousands of Bitcoin members. And in the short run, any of these mining pools do effectively control the network. And if they decide to do something like, say, attack the network, well, in the short run, they can do so. What's interesting, though, is you kind of got to ask, well, how does this play into Bitcoin right now? And I would say that, first of all, you have to think in terms of what can miners actually do. Currently, they can double spend, but they don't dictate the rules, mostly. Right now in Bitcoin, we've got two classes of users. The first class is your full nodes that actually validate all the rules themselves, and the second class is your simplified payment verification nodes. They don't validate any of the rules. They just trust that the majority of mining power is following the rules that they want to agree to. And for the people in the class of simplified payment verification, SPV nodes, they're kind of placing their trust in this political class of miners. There's also other issues, such as these miners are the ones who control what transactions get into the blockchain at all. Now, not everyone agrees with, say, how Satoshi Dice earlier last year made up, I think it worked out to be at most 75% of the Bitcoin transaction volume. And that was all that volume, all those resources used for one purpose. So a lot of people call that spam. You got, say, the Eligius pool blocking Satoshi Dice transactions, and as a political entity, so to speak, they can do that. They had, I think at the time, about 10% of the hashing power, and essentially that means about 10% of the Bitcoin mining power rejects their transactions. We've also seen this in terms of what sort of transactions in general are allowed. I go work for Mastercoin and Counterparty and Colored Coins in various ways, chief scientist of Mastercoin, and for us it's a bit of an existential risk potentially, in that you could see Bitcoin miners choose to not allow us to go use the Bitcoin blockchain. Fortunately, it's a bit difficult for them to do so due to various technical things, but we have this concept right now in Bitcoin called isStandard, which is a function that gets evaluated on a transaction, says is it or is not. Does or does not it go follow this set of standard transaction templates? And the templates can only do certain things, like send money to a public key, send money to a group of public keys, or most recently, go just publish some data in the blockchain. And something like Mastercoin, because it works on top of Bitcoin, it uses Bitcoin as a publication mechanism. A lot of people think that shouldn't be allowed, and that's kind of one of the fights around Bitcoin. Do you want to go and have a Bitcoin that you can go extend in these ways that's not directly financial, or do you don't? That's really not a technical issue, that's a political issue. It's one that's got technical implications, but fundamentally that's a choice the Bitcoin community needs to make.
When you say they don't want it to be allowed, is that because it expands the size of the blockchain and both of the issues?
Well, yeah, that's one way to look at it. So the question was, does it go and expand the size of the blockchain? Well, in one sense it does, in that if you believe Bitcoin is for financial transactions of this moving money from one person to another, yes, the size of the blockchain for the scope of transactions you believe should be on Bitcoin is expanded. If you believe Bitcoin should be used for more than simple movements of money, well, it's just like any other transaction. So again, it's not really a technical issue, it's more, what do you want to use Bitcoin for?
You concentrate on the internal politics of Bitcoin and not the external one?
Yeah, I could talk endlessly about external too. This is one of those talks, this is one of those talks where there's this enormous thing and I kind of had to pick this little chunk of it. I mean, if you want to sit here for 4 hours, we can.
Just slightly in that direction, and you're talking about how the internal players can congregate enough power to take control of the blockchain for some small period of time. What about a governmental agency that said we don't like this, and they
Long story short is because Bitcoin is a linear defense against attackers. The reality is, yes, governments can choose to go spend I think it's maybe $1 billion roughly that have to spend right now, and they could definitely attack Bitcoin and destroy it, or regulate it, or make it do whatever they want it to. And that's just inherent to the system. It's not like trying to go break your PGP key. And I'll also mention an issue right now too, which is, you may have heard of it as bid undo, or replaced by fee, or essentially whether or not unconfirmed transaction is safe. And the issue there is, if I go send you money, currently on Bitcoin, I'll broadcast that transaction. It'll get to a lot, if not 100% of the Bitcoin nodes within a few seconds. And if I broadcast a second transaction spending those same inputs but to someone else, currently the default behavior of the software released by Gavin Andresen and the Bitcoin Foundation is to not accept that second transaction under any circumstance. I might go try to bribe you by paying you $50 worth of fees, and you won't accept it. On the other hand, there's no proof that this first transaction is safe. There's no proof that it'll be mined. It's just a convention. So I've proposed that we adopt a behavior where miners and nodes would simply forward transactions based on whatever's most profitable. And that's just a matter of trying to make it consistent.
When you say they don't accept it, you mean they don't put it into blocks, or they don't accept blocks that contain that transaction?
That's a very good distinction. They do not put it into blocks, and they do not propagate around the network. And speaking of your second question, so Bitcoin politics in the future. Something that was proposed recently by Mike Kerns was, well, let's suppose a miner does go and put one of these double spend transactions in a block. Mike proposed that we do either something he calls coin-based reallocation or coin-based blacklisting, where the majority of miners could go vote with their hashing power to take the block that allegedly included a double spend transaction and either in reallocation reallocate their Bitcoins to whatever the majority thought they should go, or in blacklisting simply blacklist the reward that they got from that block.
That's a way to do a reverse theft?
Yes. Yes, and that's kind of predicated on this idea that the way I would describe it is we're essentially putting more politics into the protocol. And politics is a way of then punishing bad behavior. Unfortunately, the bad behavior it's punishing isn't something you can cryptographically prove. After all, Bitcoin, the whole point of it is to cryptographically prove that some data was published, like a double spend or not. And until it's in a block, you don't have that proof. You also have issues in more general.
How can you ensure that when you have the blacklist feature, how can you know that nobody except the community will use it? Like no corporations, for example.
You can't.
So politics may be bad.
Yeah, it may be bad. Personally, I think it would be a very unwise decision to make, but it's something that's being proposed in the Bitcoin community. I think in general, I think that kind of question could lead to a regulation of mining as a whole. It may be that, for instance, you could in the future be required to apply anti-money laundering and know your customer rules to the transactions you put in your blocks. And that can work essentially because miners are identifiable to some extent. And you could go and tell them, well, according to law of the land, you may only mine transactions that follow these particular rules. Maybe it's that they need identifying info if they move more than a certain amount of money. On the other hand, it can also go the other way. Client-side validation is an interesting concept. It's what Mastercoin and Counterparty are currently prototyping, as well as colored coins to a more limited extent, where when I go give you money, or in the case of Mastercoin, when I go give you, say, a Mastercoin token or a token on top of the Mastercoin system, you don't trust someone else to tell you whether or not it's valid. Miners don't validate this, they just publish data. And you instead go do the validation yourself. You go look at the data that's being published, which is the cryptographically provable part of this whole system. And then you apply your own rules to decide, well, what should that data mean? In the case of Mastercoin, we already do this, where Mastercoin transactions are embedded within Bitcoin transactions. They consist of published data. Mastercoin clients apply rules to it, and they come up with the state of consensus, what has or has not happened in the Mastercoin system. And the only people who have to care about these rules are Mastercoin users. If they choose to use one set of rules or another set of rules, for everyone else in the system, it just doesn't matter. I also have a proposal called tree chains, which extends this concept for advantages for scalability, which I could get into, but again, how many hours do you want to sit here?
Would that be a side chain type of thing?
Yeah, it's in a sense a way of doing side chains differently. Yeah. And also go point out, what's interesting about all this stuff is, you know, if the underlying mechanism is just a way of publishing data, you can also portray it as a free speech issue. You know, what should prevent me from publishing a statement, which I'm going to say is a truthful statement, on some medium that guarantees it gets to some audience? I could just as easily be publishing WikiLeaks papers, which actually was done about a year ago. You know, I could just as easily be publishing proof that audit logs were correct. You know, proof that when I give you my financial statements, I didn't give someone else another copy of financial statements. Or an example that will probably be implemented soon with software like Tor is that even though the signatures check out, even though you know that the developers signed the software, do you know that developers gave you a special version of the software? You can't without knowing whether or not they did not publish something, which is they did not publish some other version of the software. And you can implement this on Bitcoin by just publishing the signatures in a marked public way on the Bitcoin blockchain. And when you install Tor, for instance, you could go and look through the blockchain and say, all right, that version I'm running is the only version they've published.
So a virtual courthouse, place of record.
Yeah, virtual courthouse, place of record, yeah.
Why do they have to do it on the same system as Bitcoin? Why did you not build a system that for verification issues?
So the question is, why don't they do it why do they do it in the same system? Yeah, or in Litecoin.
Create another coin and says this is a verification coin.
Well,
Why do you have to put
so this is where I think part of the politics gets into, is that A, it's very difficult for Bitcoin users to stop people from doing that. And B, from my perspective, being, say, a Tor user, if Tor did that, I would want it to be done on the most secure blockchain. Because unfortunately, this notion of consensus, the bigger your consensus, the more resources mined making that consensus secure, the more secure it is.
In the sense that there's more terahashes to prove that it really is what we said it was.
Yeah, the more terahashes, more energy really burned to say this is the one true consensus.
Before we were talking about how the mining pools actually produce the consensus, the value of that, the backing of the truth. Because this mining pool, almost 33% of the truth, it's not really so many people. Is there an optimum size for a mining, for a CPU power, so that it's still single user, full node single users, but it's enough that you can't attack the blockchain?
Well, if you look at, yeah, let me just say, so the question was, is there an optimal size for, say, the size of a mining pool? And
no, for the whole set of miners mining on a blockchain.
Yeah.
The pools are what's.
So I'll say two responses to that. One is that if you look at Satoshi's early writing, his model was something along the lines of one person, one CPU. He didn't actually envision mining pools being created in Bitcoin. He didn't realize this was something that would go happen. And in his view of Bitcoin, you would have wound up with a system where tens of thousands, millions even, of individual actors would be running this protocol. So yeah, more democratic is one way of talking about it. I mean, it's certainly harder to go and attack in that if I were to go take over 50% of the hashing power right now, on the short term, I only have to go hack into like 3 people's computers. In the long term, it's a lot more complex, but in the short term, that is about approximately true. Whereas if it were thousands of people, millions of people running the Bitcoin protocol mining, it'd be a much larger barrier to attack.
Are there other protocols that are intentionally designed?
There we go.
Thank you. Although I know Bitcoin, of course, is the front runner in all this, but are there other cryptocurrencies that are designed to be more democratic in the sense that they're designed specifically not to utilize ASICs or make it difficult for ASICs to be the prime modality and anybody like 8086 or whatever?
Unfortunately, the short answer to that question is we've tried very, very hard in the sort of Bitcoin academic community of coming up with a way of making a proof of work algorithm that's resistant to be exact, resistant to being able to create an ASIC with a low cost compared to mining with general purpose hardware. And currently, everything we've gone and tried tends to actually have a nasty side effect, which is it may be hard to create the first batch of ASICs. You get this really high barrier to entry, but if someone does spend that amount of money and creates ASIC, now they have much lower costs. Whereas in Bitcoin, because the mining algorithm is so simple, your barrier of entry is relatively low. You get a lot of competition in the mining hardware space, and hopefully, that allows end users go buy hardware, because if you're building the hardware, your incentive is just go quickly sell it, get it off to someone who can turn energy into heat in a useful way. Whereas, if you were, say, had spent say $50 million to create the first ASIC, well, you're not going to have any competitors, so you might as well just hoard the stuff. And I don't know, it may be that there is no good solution to this.
Are you looking for questions? Because I have one.
Yes, go for it.
The blockchain, it grows and grows. There's any limit to it? If you're looking for a coin that will serve humanity for the next 50 or 60 years, and there is a record of every movement of every coin from the beginning of time until 50 years from now, and you add more information like verification and all kind of other stuff, what is the limit of the information that every single user or end user that needs to go with all the blockchain with him all the way? Is there any physical limit to that information?
Well, I think the easy answer to that is yes, currently Bitcoin doesn't scale. It has terrible scaling properties. It's for the software engineers, it's O(n) squared, so if you have n users, you process n squared data. And at some point that breaks down. I mean, I've got some ideas in a variety of ways to either A, use the Bitcoin blockchain more efficiently by moving most transactions off the blockchain, and there's ways to do it either by trusting third parties, which is the obvious way. The less obvious way is you can do something called micropayment channels, where you sort of trust a third party, but they never actually have your money for any exploitable way. And finally, I've also got another idea called tree chains, where, and I should be clear, the first two are things I've worked on, but many people worked on. Tree chains is my own idea, which is to essentially restructure the blockchain to give you more trade-offs between security and scalability. Essentially, how many people have your data versus how scalable, how cheap it is to run. It's kind of a complex topic, but it's a big part of the politics right now.
Presently, if you want to mine, you have to download the entire
Yeah, if you have to mine currently, you have to download the entire blockchain, and that's kind of infeasible.
So in your opinion, 15 years down the line, are we going to still see Bitcoin, specifically Bitcoin, this currency? Are we not going to see anything because politics is going to kill it? Or will we see all of tree chains and zero-knowledge proofs and off-chain transactions safe cryptocurrency?
I guess the way I'd go put it is I'd give it, say, off the top of my head, say 30% chance it just gets effectively killed off. Either, you know, essentially turned into PayPal, which isn't very interesting, or just killed. You know, call it, say, a 30% chance that the block size doesn't actually change and the politics doesn't allow that to happen. But if that's true, you know, Bitcoin will be used, if it's used widely, it will still be useful in that you can use it as a base layer for protocols on top of it. And I'll arbitrarily give it, say, 30% chance that we change the way blockchains work. I mean, I can't really look into the future, but there are kind of three options there, and I think they're sort of all equally likely.
Is that actually possible that you could change the protocols like that?
Yeah.
And not orphan the existing?
The question is that actually possible? And curiously enough, the answer is yes. You can kind of always come up with ways where we upgrade the Bitcoin protocol by limiting what's possible. There's sort of an infinite number of minor restrictions you can add. Like I can say now blocks must include the hash of this entire other system that actually does all the transactions in a useful way. And people who haven't upgraded, all they see is blocks with a little bit more data on it. And they can eventually choose to upgrade. And effectively, it's like a vote. You kind of vote to follow this new protocol.
So nothing gets deprecated if you're still in.
Yeah, nothing gets deprecated.
Oh, okay.
This question is a little bit of an ignorant question, because you talk about double spending. And I, as an end user, see my wallet and what's in it, and when I'm trying to send something that I don't have, it tells me you don't have enough coins. How physically it happens double spending? If you don't have, if you send a Bitcoin, it's reduced Bitcoin from your wallet and it adds up in somebody else's wallet. So how physically happens double spending?
So there's two things to remember. One is that if I don't have the money, I can't send it, because I can't fool you into accepting coins that don't exist. However, I can go fool you into accepting coins that I've given to someone else. And the purpose of Bitcoin is to distinguish between those cases and let you be sure that I hadn't given the coins to someone else.
You send it, it's reduced from your wallet. You don't have it to send it again.
But that's it. It isn't. It's digital data. It never leaves your wallet. What's actually happening is that you've created a statement saying, as of this block, I want to go and move this money, which existed here, to here. And that's a statement. It gets added to a ledger of all those other statements, and you can come to consensus as in, well, as of the most recent statement, and recent is a whole other question, but as of the most recent statement, who owned what? You know, your wallet, in a sense, has your money, has all the money you gave away, has a record of all that. You're not moving something, you're making a statement in the same way as that when you send a check, you know, you're just telling your bank, okay, update my records.
I have a question regarding all the problems you were discussing earlier. And has there been any attempt, or what are your thoughts about trusting some parties to run the mining, or not even doing mining, just run the system more centrally?
I guess I would call that the PayPal option. I mean, it's certainly possible. In fact, I think if you did that, assuming the parties were trustworthy, you know, Bitcoin would run a lot more efficiently. It'd be a lot cheaper. Unfortunately, you know, when was the last time you found a third party that you can trust 100% to be apolitical? And they just don't exist. And we've kind of found it the hard way. You know, there's been a lot of work on financial crypto from the 90s and so on that tried doing exactly that. And unfortunately, all those efforts failed because you can't find a trusted third party.
You can trust big companies like Google and Amazon.
Or PayPal.
Universities.
You're free to make such a system, but you know, having access to money and having control over money seems to go turn trusted companies untrusted.
Hey, what's your take on proof of stake algorithms?
Proof of stake algorithms are interesting because there's the problem with them is called the nothing at stake problem, which is that, you know, when we talk about consensus, the reason why Bitcoin consensus works is to choose a version of history that you want to be the official version of history. You actually have to give something up. You know, I have to go plug in a miner to a wall outlet, and I'm turning valuable electricity into heat. And I can only do that for a given version of history. What proof of stake is, it's saying, well, whoever signs the most Bitcoins in support of some version of history is the group that gets to choose what history is the official history. Unfortunately, if I'm the attacker, I can go and do that multiple times. I can go say, well, it'd be really great if not only did I give the money to Alice, I also gave it to Bob and also Charlie. And I can sign all three versions of history. And you as an external participant, you joining the system, well, which one's right? All you know is that there were a bunch of signatures made, but because they don't have any physical relevance, because they don't link back to something that was actually given up, you have no way of distinguishing those. And in practice, what we see is proof of stake algorithms, they get attacked, and inevitably the proof of stake system gets bolted onto a centralized system where someone just calls the shots.
Can you please express your opinion about the anonymity features, projects like Dark Wallet and Leak Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think the question was anonymity, and I think that's a big part of this sort of meta politics around it. And what's kind of interesting about it is I think the privacy and anonymity really drives the way this politics shapes out, in the sense that, for instance, my last slide I mentioned anti-money laundering, know your customer regulations. And if you have a Bitcoin where the lower level is free for people to use as they wish, inevitably people can find ways to go use it anonymously. And if they can find ways to use it anonymously, well, then the question is, do you accept blocks that have moved money anonymously? If you do, you enable anonymity. And I think it kind of becomes this kind of sharp binary divide. You either have a system where it's highly regulated and it looks more and more like PayPal, or it has hints of unregulation, which then leads to more people not following the regulations because they can, and you wind up in a system where you can use it in a very unregulated way.
Can't you just add superstructure on top of that basal thing, so that if you want to be, pure during the snow for regulatory agencies?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. So I can always go choose to use Bitcoin in a way that is public, or I can even choose to use Bitcoin in a way where my transactions are revealed to a subset of people. But if you don't enforce that on the underlying system, I can also choose to not do that. And Bitcoin provides you that option. I mean, John Matonis of the Bitcoin Foundation calls it user-definable privacy or user-definable transparency, and that's my choice.
Is there actually possibility, like in the future, in 10 years, to limit those features of anonymity?
Absolutely. You just go regulate Bitcoin at the mining level. It's certainly possible to do so, and we can certainly make it easier for Bitcoin to end up in that way. But I don't think Bitcoin's very interesting if it kind of has those regulations. Why not just use a trusted third party like PayPal, and it'll work a lot faster and with less money spent on mining.
Can I have the microphone so I have a louder voice?
We have consensus on that.
My question is actually, first, thanks for exposing all these issues and politics. I think it makes Bitcoin stronger if we survive all those problems. I think you didn't mention selfish mining, so maybe I kind of lost where this discussion went, but is there still this issue of miners trying to race and have gain the system, and did we solve it?
So essentially, selfish mining is a byproduct of the politics in Bitcoin as it is, and the way it's a byproduct is simply because selfish mining only works with relatively large mining pools. Now, in theory, you can run the math and it looks like it has a small advantage if you're even, a single miner, but your advantage is so small that in practice I don't see people having any reason to go try it out. On the other hand, if you're a 30% mining pool, selfish mining can make a lot of sense. And the only defenses there are really political. It's really people saying, well, they're selfish mining, that's bad, you should stop contributing hashing power. Of course, if they happen to go own all the mining equipment, then there's really nothing you can go do about it. And I think your defense against that is really construct Bitcoin in a way that you don't have large mining pools. which there are proposals on the horizon, but that's not implemented yet.
By finding algorithms, as I was suggesting earlier, that were not so ASIC friendly?
Actually, not with that. With making it impossible for, well, currently, like a mining pool, they work on the fact that they can essentially, if you change the protocol so that if you were the person with the hashing power who found a block, you could then steal the reward later, then the only way to operate a large mining pool would be if all the hardware could be trusted, not to go steal the reward later. Well, you can construct such a protocol where that's not true, and then suddenly the ability to operate, say, a big pool with 30% of the hashing power goes away. And unfortunately, at the hardware level, it seems, due to physics, that hashing power is inherently more profitable to run in at least a somewhat decentralized way, because you can go do things with heat. You can go heat your house, you can heat your water. You know, at the very least, it's cheaper to just let ambient heat, just let the heat of a mining equipment just dissipate into ambient rather than running air conditioning. So if you're operating, say, 5% of the Bitcoin network, you're going to spend more money per hash than if you were operating at 1%. At some point, the economics go the other way around and overhead matters, but there's sort of the sweet spot, and it's not 30%, it's not 50%. It's more like 0.1% or 0.01%. We're not quite sure, but fortunately that physics exists.
My question relates to what you were talking about. We are talking about incentives. When the system is linear, the incentive is to aggregate resources, like in a mining pool, and then you get more power. And then the system becomes more leaning towards centrality. So my question is, how can the incentives of the system be anti-centrality? I think you were speaking about it now. You can heat your house, you can gain other things if the system is not central. But are these things worth more than the value of Bitcoin you could mine if you were in a central mining pool? That's my question.
Well, the question is really one of linearity, and I would go argue that the process of turning electricity into heat and math equations is not linear. There is, as you get larger in scale, you do get decreasing returns. And unfortunately, that's offset by, for instance, that you have overheads, like you got to run a Bitcoin node. You gotta even just think about it. You got to go and do some maintenance and stuff. But it does appear that the sweet spot for what's most profitable is not a large mining pool, somewhere in between.
Have you looked at the development of the DNS system, like in the early days of the internet, and it's kind of decentralized, but somewhat centralized, and maybe that's a suitable model for Bitcoin?
Well, I would actually argue the DNS system in the early internet was centralized, but it was a centralized group in that everyone who participated in the early internet knew each other, so it was quite easy to just collectively operate a centralized system. There was a host file that people would literally pass around saying, well, according to our kind of rough consensus in the small community, the host file is this name maps to this IP address. And that worked fine, up to maybe 200 people. And I don't think there was ever really a point where it was a decentralized system. After that, well, what did they do next? They said, all right, let's go assign an authority to maintain this file. All right, let's go and write some software that can go and delegate based on that authority. And at no point is that really a decentralized system.
What about proposals to make it easier for individuals to run nodes?
I think they're great. And I think, unfortunately, with the way Bitcoin scales, those proposals are very hard to actually make work. You've got the fundamental problem that you have 1 megabyte blocks, and you need to go process that data in a relatively short amount of time to mine on your own. And currently, if you own hashing power, well, you'd have to go run that node, whereas it's much easier and cheaper just point your hashing power at someone else and let them do the work for you. I think we're going to have to either accept that level of centralization, or in the future maybe we'll change Bitcoin in a more fundamental way so that that centralization isn't possible.
Usually when I talk about the power balance between that decides what Bitcoin is, I talk about three groups. I talk about the miners, the developers, and the users.
Yeah.
Right, and so sort of a consensus between them. And there's also a subdivision of developers nowadays to the those with the Bitcoin foundations and those outside of it. What's your view on this power balance?
I think we don't really know how it works because we haven't seen that power balance be challenged in any way. A good example is the Bitcoin Core software, which is maintained by a group of so-called core developers, and no one's actually come up with a plausible alternative to that. Now, people have gone and rewritten Bitcoin from the ground up, but unfortunately, when you try to write a compatible version of Bitcoin, you find out very hard that that's actually very, very difficult because you have to match the behavior of the first version exactly. Now, on a technical level, I think it's being accepted within the people who study this stuff that the right way to fork Bitcoin Core is to just take the code and copy it and apply your own policy to it. For instance, what transactions are allowed is policy. It is not the core protocol, it's just policy. But nobody's actually done this in a reasonable way. Nobody's kind of formed a group doing that. I mean, I personally have plans to go and look into this, but I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm not going to know till I try.
Because of the network effect, the rate there's so much social value.
Well, the question is network effect. And, for some things, the network effect matters. For some things, it doesn't. Like with this unconfirmed transactions thing, I can destroy the utility of unconfirmed transactions if, say, 1% of miners run my version. So in that case, the network effect doesn't exist. If I want to go and do an upgrade to the Bitcoin scripting system, network effect does exist. I need buy-in from 50%. So it depends on a case-by-case basis.
Who's handling the politics outside of Bitcoin? Who's handling the negotiation with governments officials or with people, policymakers? And how they decide for me as a user what to agree with the government to do with that Bitcoin and what not to do.
So is anyone in this audience working for government right now? Because if you are, I guess I'm one of the people handling negotiation with government. I mean, there is no central body doing it. I think it's this very disorganized set of people. The Bitcoin Foundation is probably the most well-known group that is handling that kind of negotiation. But equally, there's other groups in the Bitcoin community say, well, we don't need to negotiate at all. Other groups that say, well, we're just going to go tell them what they're doing. I mean, my personal take on it is, I certainly am willing to go talk to people in government. But I'll be frank to them is that, well, I have my plans, you may have your plans, and it's great talking to you, and now I can go learn what you're doing and probably think of ways to counter it.
When you talk to the government, how do I know what your take about your vision of what the Bitcoin is and what should be in the future? Because I think, my opinion, and it's also in my opinion, government should not tax money whatsoever. So they can tax property, they can tax everything else. Money is just a means of exchange, and they should not tax it. That's the whole idea of Bitcoin. I can move it around as long as it's money.
You see, I'm not actually worried about governments taxing money. I don't see them likely to do that. I'm much more worried about governments saying that you need permission from us to move money. If it actually were that somehow they could only, say, put a 1% tax on every Bitcoin transaction, it wouldn't bother me one bit. I wouldn't really care. I just want a system where it's my choice to do that transaction. They can never apply a so-called 100% tax to it. They can't go treat it any differently than any other transaction. Or if I just want to go publish some data, like some truthful statement on Bitcoin, they shouldn't have the ability to censor that statement. That should be my choice to publish it.
Back on the same topic I asked before, is it possible to reject or accept blocks based on their having been mined from a certain pool?
If the pool creates blocks that are identifiable, yes. If everyone creates blocks that are identifiable, yes, in the sense that if you are not identifiable, I can reject you on that basis.
Is that the case currently?
Well, currently most miners, they mine blocks in such a way that they're roughly identifiable. It's not perfect identification, But there are, characteristics like what address did it pay the Coinbase out to that tend to be something you can go track.
So would it be possible for me as a full Bitcoin node to reject blocks based on them coming from the Bitcoin mining pool I consider to be too large?
Absolutely. On the other hand, if you go do that, you're going to find out that you're just one person trying to prevent information from getting around. And I believe the quote belongs to Satoshi that Bitcoin security relies on the fact that information is easy to spread and hard to censor. And you may choose not to spread that information, but many other people will choose to. On the other hand, if you have hashing power, you can choose not to build on top.
It would be great if they were as smart as I was, though.
Well, it's not a matter of being smart. It's whether or not you're choosing to spread information. I mean, if I'm a miner, it's in my advantage to know when a block is created under any circumstance, under the assumption that everyone else also is thinking along those lines. If they choose not to, if we say got a group of more than a majority of hashing power said, all right, Bitcoin blocks now must come from these known entities, then they could certainly choose to only allow Bitcoin blocks to be mined by known entities. I think a lot of people would call that an attack on the system. Equally, you could go say, all right, we're going to choose to not build on blocks that came from this set of known entities, but not this other set, or unknown people. Well, of course, if you were ghash.io, your immediate response would be to hide the fact that your blocks were coming from you. And I think that'd actually be a net detriment to the community because then you wouldn't have the knowledge of how big ghash.io is. Currently they could be mining 75% of the hashing power for all we know. They could be redirecting that hashing power to creating blocks that have no identifying info. So a proposal like that very quickly leads to, well, all right, everyone must be identified.
Can you please say anything about Satoshi dice? Is it a DOS attack or is it a valid transactions? What's your opinion?
Well, I would say in Bitcoin, the way you resist DOS attacks is you make them expensive. Satoshi dice pays fees, therefore the anti-DOS protections in Bitcoin are working. And in fact, what's happened with Satoshi dice is as Bitcoin fees have gone up in their fiat value, the number of Satoshi dice transactions has gone down a lot, and most gambling appears to be done on non-blockchain sites, such as, Just Dice.
Is there a gambling on microchannels?
I'm sure there will be soon.
Do you know why the mining pools become so large? Why aren't there smaller mining pools?
I think it's just a matter of incentives. If I have $1,000 worth of mining equipment, I want that $1,000 of mining equipment to earn the most money. And the way to make it earn the most money is by pointing at a reliable pool. And the fact is, a lot of these big pools are pretty reliable. They're run by competent administrators. Whereas if I say used peer-to-pool, which is sort of a peer-to-peer pool that's fully decentralized, I personally do that myself, but it means I got to set up a computer, I got to maintain it. It's kind of a pain in the ass. I mean, I could save a couple hours a month of my time by not doing that and just mining at ghash.io.
There's no inherent advantage for a very large pool, is it?
There is, unfortunately. Yeah, after certain levels, you earn slightly more money than not. And you also can spread your overhead over more people. They can also go and screw you over and steal your money, but currently they don't seem to do that very often, and users don't seem to care very much. And even if they start doing that, we can devise protocols where they go prove that they are giving you the amount of money you deserve for your mining effort and prove honesty, which again means you're back to a situation where mining at a large pool earns you more money.
Yeah, I'd like to add a few words about that. So we need to distinguish between two different cases. One which is a mining entity, which is like a large corporation that keeps a big mining farm and maybe develops its own ASIC chips. So that's one sense in which mining can be centralized. But another sense is when you have miners at home running a device, doesn't matter if it's a GPU device or an ASIC device that they bought, but they don't mine solo, but they point their mining power to a pool. Now, in this setting, you have a tendency for everyone to go to the biggest pool because there are performance advantages. The pool can choose a mine pool reward method, and it has some parameters which it can use to determine the trade-off between several performance parameters. One, the major one is the variance that the miner experiences. You can also talk about the fees and the maturity time, but variance is the classical problem. Now, the bigger a pool is, the lower the variance is for the miners to come to it. So eventually, if you have one pool that is bigger, everyone will just go to it until it becomes all the miners.
The difference becomes
it's very significant. If, let's say, we want 1,000 pools, so it will be more or less decentralized. So a pool with 0.1% of the mining power will have a lot of variance. So people will prefer the pool which has 40% of the mining power. Now, the good news is this is a problem that I think can be solved because it all relies on a very specific way that pools issue the rewards. But there are different frameworks that do not require a change in protocol that allow it to be more centralized. And the goal, there are several approaches. The goal is that if you have, let's say, a pool that is 70% of the mining power and a pool that is 30% of the mining power, then in the current situation, you want to go to the pool with the 70%, and then it will go larger. But with these alternative methods, the optimal strategy for you will be to dedicate 70% of your mining power to this pool and 30% to this pool. And this way you preserve the equilibrium. So each pool can compete not on the size that it already has, but on the other features that it can offer. So there are a few versions. The one which I currently support the most is something called the multi-PPS, which is something that I developed where the idea is that each miner in the generation intersection distributes the rewards to several pools, and each gives him a reward based on their share. And this way, so the optimal solution is to distribute the mining power between all pools, and you don't have this advantage of size. So even if you have a very small pool with low reserves, you will still want to direct some of your mining to it. You don't have this centralization.
Many has some excellent papers on this topic. I've tried to read through a lot of them, and they're certainly worth reading if you want to see how the math of this really works at a low level.
Yeah, and I'll comment that so I'd like to comment that the specific thing I mentioned does not appear in that paper that Peter mentioned. It's a later development. I don't know, it exists mostly in the form of a forum post, but maybe a few related forum posts. But like I said, there are some potential solutions to this specific solution. It's not going to this specific problem. It's not going to solve the problem that huge mining farms have a big advantage in the hardware development environment, but I think it can pretty elegantly solve the problem of normal miners that currently mine the biggest pools.
Do we know if the ASIC miners are playing a fair game today, or are they like embedding, let's say, a SAT solver inside the chips for prediction? And that's
Define fair.
Pardon?
Define fair. Like, do you mean fair as in they're actually doing the SHA-256 calculation?
Or are they like having like if you add a SAT solver inside?
Oh, you're thinking of like algorithmic attacks on SHA-256. What's interesting actually with the hardware is because it's so simple, people have gone and taken ASIC hardware, taken the chips apart, and with a microscope looked at them, and you can tell right away that the hardware is what it claims to do. You don't necessarily know, maybe there's some tiny backdoor, but it certainly works roughly the way it should do, which is to have a whole bunch of SHA-256 cores hashing away. And you can see this just on a microscope.
You were suggesting backdoors in the sense that somebody might be planning.
I think he's talking about like SAT solvers, for instance, that solve the SHA-256 hash in a more efficient way. And we know that we can tell the hardware is certainly not doing that. In addition, it'd be a huge advance in mathematics, get a significant speed up.
Somebody can manufacture this this mining ASIC and not show it to anybody, and thus achieve higher hashes.
Well, like I say, it would be a huge advance in cryptographic research to...
Was that supposed to be something negative that occurred, that they had higher efficiencies in hashing?
Yeah, he's talking about efficiency. And, you know, there certainly are ways to optimize parts of the SHA-256 hash, but the speed up is, you know, you're talking, say, 50% speed up at most, 20%. It's not, you know, orders of magnitude.
Why wouldn't that be fair?
Well, that's also, yeah, that's also why I said defined fair, you know? Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, it's certainly that they have very efficient implementations. They certainly do a lot better than you would expect if you didn't know the details of how the math works. But equally, you know, we're only talking, say, 50% at most speed up, and we know that the hardware that's shipped to the public does roughly what it claims to, you know? Beyond that is a huge advance in crypto math.
Just want to clarify one earlier point about those guys who were concerned about blow up in the data size in the far future. So you listed some possible solutions regarding off-chain transactions and stuff like that. Those were more focused on the volume of the current transaction that happened on the network, but just I think that the question was also about the size of the entire history, and there the problem is a little easier. We can have like trustless checkpoints of the history that all these spent transactions from Genesis according to the rules of the protocol until some point of time reach this unspent transaction set. And
what mechanism of trustless checkpoints are you talking about?
This is a snark.
Oh yes, yeah, those are certainly possible. Yeah.
So this snark, it can be like a 50 kilobyte proof, and in the far future, this can be possible to compress the blockchain.
But unfortunately, even if you compress historical information, you still get the problem that you have to keep up with this constant bandwidth. Currently, that's very easy. You know, it's only works at be a few, maybe kilobyte per second worth of bandwidth, and bursts of, say, a megabyte per second to have very good profitability. But if you increase the block size very quickly, that's not the case. You know, if you want, say, a 10 megabyte block, if you want, say, a 10 megabyte block size, suddenly people mining behind Tor with current technology are probably not able to make a profit. You know, in a significant degree difference than in a more centralized pool. So we're kind of constrained there, and I think you really need a different way of structuring blockchains to get past that.
Yeah, so I'm not talking about it, so I agree with you. So what do you think about the Ghost protocol?
I don't think you're solving the problem that's actually at hand with memory. I think Ghost, I mean, we can go talk about this on a lot of levels, but I think it looks to me like Ghost still provides ways for larger miners to, roughly speaking, bully smaller miners. You know, and you kind of can't have that sort of incentive because you still have the political problems with centralization in that case. You know, you can never go assume people behave honestly for any definition of honest. You got to assume people behave economically rationally. And additionally, it'd be very nice if you can create protocols where even irrational attackers can't attack you.
What is the relation to bullying of the small miners with Ghost? How would it happen?
I'd have to go refresh my details on exactly how Ghost was, but I remember looking at it. Essentially, if you are a larger miner and you deliberately go use a large amount of bandwidth, you know, you allow a large amount of bandwidth to be used by, say, the block size you have, you can go and manipulate the way the network works to make this to make the orphan rates of other smaller miners still matter. You know, Ghost may provide security, but it doesn't provide security in the sense that the rewards for the security are distributed, which then leads to insecurity due to politics.
So I want to comment about this. Of course, Ghost has a problem with centralization. Larger miners do get more than their share. And I think this is an inherent problem in Bitcoin because a large miner, before he even sends the block to anyone, already has his own hashing power working on the problem and extending the block. This is something that's very inherent to the protocol. So if you are larger, you get this free free dispersal of your block to a lot of computational power without even leaving your data center.
A really interesting example of that is you can ask yourself the question, all right, suppose I found a block and I have some percentage of the hashing power. Should I even bother publishing this block to other miners if my goal is to find more blocks that end up in the main chain than they do? And as it turns out, when you run the math, if you have more than about 33% hashing power, a number that's actually basically identical to the selfish mining paper, you have no incentive to publish your block because you're probably going to find one more block before the other group of miners find 2 blocks. And like I say, if your goal is to find more blocks than them rather than just earn money from mining rewards, which is true if transaction fees are what matter, then why should I publish? Why don't I just go and screw them and let them earn less money? You know, it's very, very similar to the selfish mining paper, but what's curious about it is, unlike the selfish mining paper, if block size is much larger, this can happen sort of by accident. I mean, one proposal by Gavin was to have no limit on the block size, and it would be as large as you could propagate and have other miners mine on it. Well, if I add, say, a gigabyte worth of transactions, and I have 30% of the hashing power, and there's one other 10% mining pool with a gigabyte per second internet connection, well, I'm going to find my income go up because I'm mining these enormous blocks. It doesn't matter to me that all the other little miners don't get it. I still earn more money. And unlike selfish mining, it doesn't look like I've done anything bad. I'm just protecting the network. I'm helping mine. I'm helping people do their transactions at low cost.
It sounds to me that selfish mining is a good stuff because it prevents centralization. Is it true?
But selfish mining only works effectively the more centralized you become. You know, selfish mining isn't selfish as it attacks someone big, it attacks small people, to kind of oversimplify. So I would say no, it's not good for centralization at all.
What is your take about the whale bot, the Willy the whale, and the Empty Gox recent findings?
Haven't read it.
So one of the ways in which the political issues are expressed in a quantifiable way is in the maximum size of the op return transaction to add metadata.
Yes.
And it was interesting, because what I'm doing is very affected by this. The drop from 80 to 40 bytes that happened quite soon before the release of Bitcoin 0.9. Can you shed any light on the process through which that decision is made and how future decisions might be made about whether to increase or decrease that limit?
Well, the process was very simple. Some people talked about it on IRC, and someone submitted a GitHub patch, and I think it was accepted to the Bitcoin Core repository in GitHub, but a day later. I mean, I didn't actually know they'd done this until after the fact, and people call me a Bitcoin Core developer, so it kind of says something about how little consultation was done. And my perspective, if anything, I'm kind of glad they did that, because it gives me an opportunity to go point out the problems with that process. And equally, I'd also gone and worked on protocols such as to embed Mastercoin transactions where, well, if they go block, say, op return, well, we can use other ways of embedding the data. And currently, you know, that's what I'm working on. Well, one of the many things I'm working on with Mastercoin and counterparties, just coming up with a robust, good way to do that. I'd prefer not to have to deploy that kind of solution. It'd be much nicer if people would agree that, yes, it's useful if Bitcoin can support new applications, but, you know, that's always an option. So I guess we'll have to see how that shapes up in the next few months.
What is your opinion, like, there is one centralization point in the Bitcoin now, which is the code itself. I mean, this is one project sitting on GitHub and the only one. What's your take on implementing other libraries or other projects implementing the same stuff or the same protocol specification to decentralize the code itself?
Well, you have to remember the actual source code on GitHub under, you know, github.com Bitcoin/Bitcoin. It's really two separate things. One is the core consensus code, and the other is a bunch of code around that sets policies, that, you know, happens to have a GUI, happens to have a wallet. And I would say that on what the Bitcoin protocol is the code that actually implements the consensus. You know, we found out the hard way that you just can't have a paper document and actually implement that and get it right. in the sense that your implementation will be identical to my implementation. You know, Bitcoin has to be bit for bit compatible. If you have a bug that I don't, and you are 60% of the hashing power, for all intents and purposes, the bug is the protocol. And there seems to be no way around this. I mean, client-side validation is something I'm interested in precisely because it can leave the mining power to do a much simpler task of just publishing data and proving that it was published and nothing else. Whereas currently Bitcoin, I mean, analogy I would say is it's kind of the difference between the telephone network and the internet. In the internet, we have this really, really simple layer, which is IP, that does nearly nothing other than move data around in a defined way. And we build on top of that with all of these layers that you choose to use. With the telephone, at the core of the network was a lot of logic. You know, your call waiting, your all these different features that got added. And the process to add a feature was this convoluted thing of asking for permission and lobbying other people to do things. Well, you know, if you're an entrepreneur trying to do something interesting, which protocol do you want to deal with? You want to deal with internet because you don't have to ask permission. And with Bitcoin, unfortunately, right now, it's the other way around.
You know, I just want to point out that that question was asked of Gavin in Amsterdam, and Gavin said that, first of all, he'd love to see more implementations. And actually, we keep saying there's one implementation. There are actually at least 3 full implementations with BTCD and ASIC proof, which barely anybody uses, but
yeah.
But BTCD is very well implemented. Sorry, here I haven't seen the code, but it's very plausible that there will be better implementations and people will start using BTCD more. And actually, what you said about the bugs, they are in the protocol. There are a few bugs there in the protocol. You know this.
Well, I've gone and re-implemented a lot of the protocol myself in my Python Bitcoin lib library, and I've also gone and written firmware for safety critical applications where if the firmware failed, someone could die. And I think Python Bitcoin lib was a harder problem than writing safety critical firmware. Because at least with writing safety critical firmware, you get to go choose how you do it. You get to go choose the problem up front. With Bitcoin, we already have this huge pile of people mining one protocol. And if you go add something, you must follow that, or you can create security problems. For instance, if you are 20% of the hashing power and you have some tiny, tiny little bug that could be something we haven't caught for years, which happens over and over again, I can go use the fact that you are producing blocks at 1/4 the rate of the network to attack someone else. You know, that's a security problem. And I just don't agree with Gavin at all. I mean, a lot of people I respect don't agree with him at all. If anything, I'd say within the community of Bitcoin developers, that opinion that you will see implementations that are bug compatible is nearly non-existent, with the exception of Gavin. And I don't know why he holds that opinion, but he does, and I just think he's wrong.
No, maybe I don't know the technical side, and the question sounds weird, but there is any way in the system to actually design into it that any change in a core system have to get approval of 80 or 70 or 90% and not just 50 or whatever. And the other question is, all the technical problems that you discussed, are there any other coins, the brothers and sisters of Bitcoins, and try to address it and actually solve some of the problems effectively?
I'll answer the second question first, which is that other coins, they've run into these problems over and over again. Dogecoin, they repeatedly changed, even though they only had one implementation, they changed minor parts of their implementation, and they found out that one release didn't actually implement the same protocol as another release. And with Dogecoin, their community was sufficiently centralized that it was very easy to just go out and say, uh-oh, we screwed up, here, go upgrade to this. And very quickly, the people with hashing power would upgrade. But the fact that you can do that means, well, it's fairly centralized community. You know, if you couldn't do that, that implies something kind of good because it isn't centralized and it is hard for people to kind of shift. And it's certainly a danger, but it's kind of a new field of computer science, and I don't know that we know how to go and work with this any better. You know, you can go and try to devise voting protocols and stuff, but if you, say, have a mechanism where a majority of hashing power can vote for this change, They can just as easily vote for a change that's considered bad by a large part of the community. They can go vote for a change that as a side effect makes money out of thin air. And if you're...
will vote for a change that you will lose everything that you have. So that means if you work with the threat power that you're going to lose as well, then nobody will try to screw it over.
But you see how you're introducing politics into it. You know, a computer algorithm can't distinguish between a good and a bad change. It can just run some algorithm that happens to go and follow changes. So by introducing a mechanism for mining power to vote on changes, and using this mechanism a lot, well, then you have all those other users who, I may be a Bitcoin user, I might not directly run mining power, I may not have, a gigahash worth of equipment in my backyard, but economically I'm part of the community. I mean, shouldn't I get a say in what happens? And if it's hashing power making these changes, well, I could argue I don't. And, long story short, it's this very complex topic, and I don't think we really have any idea yet of how that plays out, other than we know that there's been a lot of failures in altcoins that, for instance, accidentally fork their networks.
I just have a comment about the earlier question about the op return and 40 to 80 bytes. Well, in Amsterdam, someone asked Gavin about that. And he basically said, well, we were listening to our users. Or we listen to our users. And if a large community of users would ask for larger op return sizes, that would be implemented. So I'm not asking for a specific reply, just quoting Gavin on that.
Yeah. An interesting thing there is, now there are more users of op return than there used to be. And as an example, the stealth address feature, which I'm championing with Dark Wallet, there is reason that it could need more than 40 bytes to go operate under some cases. Or for instance, it could need more than one op return output in a single transaction. And I'm planning to fairly soon just submit a patch to the Bitcoin Core GitHub repo and just see what the response is. All right, would they allow more than one op return transaction? If not, well, that's interesting. If so, well, that's also interesting. And I think we'll start to feel out, how does this politics really play out? I don't really know what's going to happen.
Okay, so that's all the time we have today. So thank you very much to Peter. So thanks, Peter, and thank you all for listening. So a few announcements to close up. If you haven't already, you can look for the Israel Bitcoin Meetup group and sign up there. This way you will get notifications about any future events we will have. Now one event we'll have 2 months from now, on the 28th of July, is the Israeli Bitcoin Conference, which is a global conference joint work with between the Israeli Bitcoin Association and Inside Bitcoins. So look it up. It's going to be like all the big conferences that you have around the world. We will have it this time here in Israel. So you're all welcome to look up the details and sign up. Now, yes, so if you have the itch to talk more about the Bitcoin, more than we have in these meetups, you're always welcome to the Bitcoin Embassy at Achuzat Bait 1 Tel Aviv. So yeah, we have this space however much we want, and Peter, I guess, will also stay here a while longer if you have more questions. So that's it, and enjoy the rest of your evening.